What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen and I am back with another true crime video. Thank you guys for your patience. I know I haven't posted a video in the past 2 weeks. I've taken that time to spend time with both of my kiddos. My youngest is going into kindergarten, so I had to prep for a lot of new homeschooling. So it's been quite the past 2 weeks, and I appreciate you guys sticking around and waiting for me to come back. Now, today is yet another video in the series where we speak about cases that have somehow inspired new laws or changes, and this is another really huge one that I feel like a lot of people are aware of. They know about this case, they've heard about it, maybe they don't know the impact that it had. So today we're going to be speaking about the abduction of Charles Brewster Ross, and he went by the name of Charlie. Charlie was only 4 years old when he was abducted in 1874 from his prestigious neighborhood in Germantown, Pennsylvania. It was a small town right outside of Philly, and his case is actually known as the very first child abduction. I am sure there had been plenty of child abductions prior to this, but this was just kind of the very first one that was noticed and something was really done about. It was the very first one that was nationally publicized, which was a very huge deal, and it's actually believed to be behind the phrase, "Don't take candy from strangers." So there's a whole lot happening here. It's really old, so there's a lot of history and things to unpack and understand how things were so different then, and then be able to see how much has changed now. So this is definitely one that I wanted to be able to share with you guys. And while there are at least 3 individuals thought to have some sort of knowledge of the crime or possibly be involved in the crime, the answers of where Charlie is or what happened to him are still unknown to this day. Before we get into the details, I want to say a huge thank you to Audible for partnering with me on today's video. Companies like Audible, especially Audible that's been working with me for years at this point, helps to support my channel so that I can create these videos and give back to these families and organizations that I believe in as much as possible. Audible is the leading provider for spoken word entertainment and my personal favorite way to consume content. They have an endless amount of genres, so there's something for absolutely everyone. They have everything from audiobooks to Audible originals, podcasts, sleep tracks, guided meditation, guided fitness. So if true crime podcasts are your thing, or maybe you want to listen to some newly released audiobooks, Audible has you covered. You can listen anytime, anywhere, so it's incredibly convenient if you're someone that's constantly on the go or you love some sort of entertainment while you're doing daily chores. I also rely on Audible a lot, speaking of homeschooling, for homeschooling my children. Audible makes things a lot easier on my end when I'm trying to school my children and then also work at the same time. Members also have a ton of great perks. You get to choose one title a month that you get to keep forever. Plus, you also have access to their all new Plus catalog with a huge and growing selection, and all of that Plus catalog is just included in your membership. Now, I personally just listened to Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter, which is a recommendation straight from you guys. You guys did warn me that it can be a little bit triggering and intense, and you were not wrong about that, but when I tell you it was an amazing audiobook, I am not joking. The story of a missing girl and her family that essentially never got answers. So decades later, the missing girl's sisters end up face to face for the first time in a really long time, and they are given the opportunity to essentially solve their sister's crime. So it's a lot going on. They end up questioning everyone that's been in their life ever since their sister's disappearance. It is intense, and the ending is honestly very satisfying. So if you want to check out Pretty Girls or any of the other endless options that Audible has to offer, you can try Audible out as a new member for free for 30 days. All you have to do is go to audible.com/Danielle or text Danielle to 500-500. Thank you again to Audible, and now on to the details of the abduction of Charles Brewster Ross, who I will be referring to as Charlie for the remainder of this video. Now, as a quick little preface here, this is an incredibly old case. This case is from the 1870s, so a lot of this information could possibly be misinformation, incorrect information that's all over the place. Talking about a case like this can sometimes be like a game of telephone. I've tried to collect the most accurate information possible, but some small details could have possibly been thrown in throughout the decades to make things sound more interesting, which unfortunately is something that does happen. So if you do have a correction and a source, please always feel free to list it in the comments down below. So Charlie was born on May 4th, 1870 to Christian and Sarah Ross. He had one brother, and from most of the resources that I looked at, he had 4 sisters, and he was raised along with his siblings in the well-to-do neighborhood of Germantown, which is an area just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, his father owned a very successful, at the time, random local dry goods store in downtown Germantown, but unfortunately, the year prior to this, there had been a pretty big stock market crash, and because of that, his family lost a lot of money. The Ross family was pretty deep in debt. Owning a business that was from the outside seen as successful, the Ross family was just not as well off as some may have assumed, which is very important to this story. So on July 1st, 1874, 4-year-old Charlie Ross and his brother Walter, who was 5 years old, they were both playing outside of the home. Now, according to a few resources that I looked into, they were mainly taken care of by some caretakers. Their father obviously had a lot of work to do at the dry goods store. And apparently their mother at the time, Sarah, was off in Atlantic City. She had gone through some sort of illness and was there to recover. So this particular day, it's my understanding that they were being watched by a caretaker. So at some point that day, I believe it was around midday, their father decided to come home and surprise them to take them to go buy fireworks. They've been begging their father for fireworks for days at this point. Independence Day was coming up. The fireworks were all over the stores. Little boys, they were very excited about it, and their dad had previously told them, we're not getting any until Independence Day itself, because he was worried that the boys would try to set them off sometime before that while he was at work. And that's obviously not a great situation, but he had seen them begging, and so he's like, you know what, I'm gonna go home early today and get them for them because they're just so excited. But when he got home, neither of the boys were there. The caretakers told Christian Ross that the boys had in fact been playing outside. That's where they believed the boys to be. The last they saw them was on the sidewalk outside of the home, playing with a few other neighborhood children. And keep in mind, this is a very, very different time. We're talking 1874. And at this point in time, believe it or not, abductions were really not a thing. That was not something that happened. Kids didn't frequently go missing. So Christian's mind didn't immediately go where our minds would go at this point. He was thinking, okay, they're likely with a neighbor. They probably followed one of the neighbor kids home. They're there playing with their toys or in their yard. So he was not initially incredibly concerned. So he began to walk around the neighborhood in search of the boys, but he had no luck. They weren't with any of the surrounding neighbors. None of the kids knew where he had gone. And then suddenly one neighbor did come forward mentioning seeing both Walter and Charlie get into a horse and buggy cart and head off from the home with two complete strangers. This is when Christian immediately became horrified. So in those few days leading up to the 1st of July, the boys had come to Christian one of those days saying that two men had stopped by the home and given both of the boys candy. Didn't say anything strange happened other than that these two guys that did this seemed just like nice guys that wanted to hand out some candy to the kids. But Christian had this weird gut feeling that something about this was not right. So he told the boys, don't take candy from strangers, make sure to protect yourself. Next time they come here, you need to just come inside, ignore them, all of the things that you would expect a parent to typically tell a child. Christian was worried that the boys had not taken this advice, had been too excited about the idea of candy, and possibly had agreed to get into this cart and go off with these same two men. The next few pieces of information do get a little bit fuzzy, but at some point, Walter all by himself ends up coming back home. So Charlie's older brother. I don't know exactly what happened. A few of the resources state that he was found crying on the side of the road by a neighbor, so the neighbor brought him home. But again, there doesn't seem to be a specific time. The only thing I do know is that he did safely end up home, but Charlie was still nowhere to be found. So Christian continued to look into the early morning hours to locate Charlie. And the story that Walter told his father about what had happened to them that day began the very first nationally publicized kidnapping for ransom in the United States of America. Walter explained to his father that he and Charlie had in fact been playing outside that day, just like the caretakers had said. And just like Christian feared, those same two men had in fact come back by the Ross home, offering the boys candy. Walter was able to describe both of these men. One, he said, was wearing gold glasses and rings and looked like he could have possibly been a farmer. I'm assuming that was said maybe because of what he was wearing potentially. And then the other man, he was only really able to describe his nose, saying that something had happened to his nose. He said that these same two men again offered the boys candy, which they happily took, but not just that. They offered the boys something that they could not pass up. They offered to go and buy these boys fireworks. So one thing that these kids had been waiting for for days at this point, and this was an offer too good to pass up, so both of the boys got into the cart and buggy with the men and off they went. According to Walter, pretty shortly into the drive, Charlie was visibly upset, probably felt very unsafe, unfamiliar with these two strangers, but they continued on to the store despite this, and once they got there, the men gave Walter 25 cents and told him to go inside, have the time of his life, buy some fireworks, and they'd be waiting for him when he was done. But when he came out, huge smile on his face, so happy to finally have fireworks, the cart and buggy were gone, and so was Charlie. This is when it's believed that Walter just kind of wandered around, not knowing how to get home, upset and crying until he was finally found and returned to his father. Walter spent the following day taking his dad along the route that the two men had taken them, and they were able to corroborate that this was in fact the way they went, thanks to a bunch of workmen along the road along the way. They remembered these men and this cart and buggy, and they also were able to corroborate the description that Walter had given of the two men. But despite this, there was still no one who had seen Charlie. So Christian headed to the police department. But this, again, was an entirely different time. The police station in Philly had only been in operation for, I believe, around 30 years at this point. There had not been a single abduction reported in that entire time. There was no precedent that had been set. No one had any idea what to do in the situation. And unfortunately, at first, it really wasn't taken very seriously. Christian was told that these men that took his boys likely had been highly intoxicated, drunk, and doing things for kicks, and that eventually they would likely sober up and bring Charlie back after realizing what they had done. So it's a situation where the police department basically said, he's probably fine, sit it out and wait. But Christian was not very pleased with that answer. As I stated, Sarah, Christian's wife, and Charlie's mother was not in town at the time, and Christian made the decision to not tell his wife because part of him probably really did hope that the police were right, that whoever took his kids, they already let Walter go, so maybe they really weren't that dangerous, and maybe they would in fact let Charlie go as well, and he didn't want to alarm her. She's already recovering from an illness, so he was thinking, I'll be able to handle this before she gets back, everything will be absolutely fine. So he ends up reaching out to the mayor to see if he had any advice on how to handle this. So it was agreed that Christian would put out an offer for Charlie's safe return, but Christian did it anonymously again, so his wife would not see his name in the paper or, in anything and think anything of it. So a reward of $300 was put out for the return of Charlie Brewster Ross. But just after this, an unexpected letter came in the mail at the dry goods store owned by the Ross family. I think it was about 3 days after the abduction had taken place. It was a ransom note, something that I don't think anybody was expecting to see because, again, this never happened. To give you a little bit better insight, kidnapping at this point in time was still a misdemeanor, okay? Which may be a hint as to what changed after this. This note itself was sent from a random location in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, so that did not help them identify who had sent the letter, and the whole letter itself was just an absolute mess. There were multiple misspelled words. Whoever wrote it was clearly only semi-literate. I will have a photograph of this first letter up right now. I honestly don't even want to attempt to try to read it out loud, but the gist of it is just that Charlie had been taken and he was hidden where nobody could find him. The writer then demanded to be paid for the safe return of Charlie and threatened him if the police were brought in to help in search, and basically said, don't even try to search for him because he's in a place where you will never find him. Incredibly flustered, Christian decided to reach out to the police yet again because despite what the note said, that do not get the police involved, he knew there was no way he was going to be able to handle this all on his own. Now, the first thing that was decided was that the ransom was not going to be paid. First and foremost, the Ross family, despite the way it may have looked from the outside and the assumptions that may have been made by the kidnappers, they didn't have the money to pay for a ransom. And over the multiple ransom notes that ended up coming in, these men were demanding $20,000 from Christian Ross, which today is the equivalent of $400,000. That is a lot of money. And there was no way Christian Ross could come up with the money to pay for this. On top of that, they understandably found it incredibly wrong that criminals wanted to be essentially paid for the crimes that they committed, rewarded for the bad things that they had done. And they were worried that if Christian immediately cracked, said, absolutely take my money, here you go, that criminals all over would say, hey, you know what? This worked for these two kidnappers. Let's just start yanking tons of people's kids out of the front of their homes. And that was not an example that Christian or the police department really wanted to set. So they instead decided to publicize the absolute heck out of the case in hopes that it would basically smoke out whoever was responsible. Now, unfortunately, in doing so, Sarah had to learn through a newspaper that her youngest son was missing. And so she immediately headed back to Philadelphia and joined in on all of the search efforts. Philly police ended up searching every single building in the area to ensure that Charlie wasn't just being held somewhere local, hidden in some random room in a downtown building. Posters of Charlie were made and posted all over the local train stations, dry goods stores, common spaces for the town, so that people could keep an eye out. And on July 24th, weeks after Charlie had been abducted and there was still no sign of him, the mayor announced a $20,000 reward for information leading to the men involved. So the equivalent of the ransom that was being asked. Again, hoping this would encourage men to come forward. And sure enough, this reward got people talking in many different ways. Well-known politicians, public figures all started talking about the disappearance. When you went and took a walk out on the street, that is all you heard anyone speaking about. Well-respected people were out there pleading with the public to help bring home Charlie Ross, and this ended up getting the attention of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which this was essentially all they worked on, was missing persons, like random things like this all over the country. So they came on board to help in the search for Charlie, and they were able to provide a ton of resources that the family desperately needed. Thousands of posters were made at this point. The search efforts really ramped up to further the reach of awareness in hopes that it would bring some answers. From estimates that were given by the Ross family, I believe over 700,000 posters were put up in Philly and all over surrounding areas. That's a really large number. So publicizing the case made a huge impact on it. It got the attention of so many people that were able to help spread awareness, and not just that, it brought in some pretty big tips. A man named Gil Mosher ended up coming forward to Superintendent George Walling with some very disturbing information. Gil said that his brother, Bill Mosher, and his brother's friend, Joe Douglas, looked a whole heck of a lot like the sketches that had been made describing the abductors. And both men, both Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas, were well-known criminals in the Philly area. Hearing this information, George Walling ended up reaching out to police to get them involved, and also reached out to another man named William Westervelt. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of people involved. I know it's a lot of names to keep track of, but William Westervelt is actually the brother-in-law of Bill Mosher, and Bill's brother, Gil, is the one who came forward with this information. So William Westervelt not only was the brother-in-law of Bill Mosher, but he also was an ex-Philly police officer. So they're like, okay, this is an interesting situation. It's possible that, Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas could have something to do with this. We've got possible leverage with the fact that William Westervelt, his brother-in-law, isn't directly related. We could offer him something to get information. So that is exactly what they did. A deal was made with William Westervelt that if he would get in touch with both of these men and kind of try to pry information out of them to hand it over to police, and in return, his position on the police force would be reinstated. I don't know exactly why he lost it to begin with, but this seemed like a pretty good offer to William Westervelt, so he agreed. But what no one knew is that he was also playing both sides. Was in fact taking information from both Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas and feeding it to the police, but at the same time, he was taking all the information from police and feeding it to Bill and Joe, which is probably why the next few months were an absolute chaotic disaster. So the next 5 or so months, the police spent all of that time trying to chase Bill and Joe. They were desperately trying to catch these men, and it seemed like they were trying to chase a ghost. Almost every time they'd get close, these men would vanish. This whole time that they are desperately trying to catch both of these men, a total of 23 different ransom letters were sent from all sorts of random areas in Philly and surrounding areas to the Ross family, continuing to demand this ransom in order for Charlie to be safely returned to his family. So even during all of these months, it did seem possible that Charlie was still alive and well. The police came close, as I said multiple times, to capturing both of the men. At one point, I believe they were just an hour behind them, but probably because they were being fed information from the police and what the police were doing, they were able to get out of these different locations just in time. There were a handful of times that there were these planned arrangements to meet with these men to give them the ransom. I don't think they ever actually planned to do that, but they essentially were trying to trick these men into coming to a certain location to arrest them. But I think a handful of those times, the men either claimed that they were too broke after the fact to get there. And on top of that, it seems that the abductors, possibly Bill and Joe, were loving the crime that they had committed and were considering committing it again. So an informant ended up coming forward claiming that both of these men, Bill and Joe, had been going around Philly asking for help in the abduction of another child, either the child or a grandchild of Cornelius Vanderbilt. They clearly saw a huge opportunity in what they were doing. All the letters were still coming in. Christian Ross realized, these men, whoever took my son, they're able to communicate with me, but I have no way to communicate with them. So he actually began to use the public ledger personal column to kind of send messages out in hopes that they would be received. And from the way it's described, it seemed like this was one of the main ways in which they set up and arranged a lot of what was going to happen. The main agreement that seemed to have been made when it comes to giving the ransom and getting Charlie back was that once the money was dropped, these men claimed that within 5 hours of receiving the money, Charlie would be safe at home. Everything would be over. But again, each time something happened, so it never ended up working out. A committee ended up being formed to help the search alongside Pinkerton and Philly police. And unfortunately, when this happened, it seemed to make the abductors mad. That's at least my personal take on it. So instead of this 5-hour return window and these claims that Charlie's fine, we've got him, we'll return him within 5 hours, they changed it to, we don't even have Charlie anymore. He's alive. We just don't have him. And now you're not going to get him until 10 hours after we receive the money. So on July 30th, a huge drop plan was basically put in place. It was like one of the last ditch efforts to make this ransom exchange work. Christian ended up boarding a late night train that would go to Albany, New York, and the plan was for him to stand at the very end cart. There was a certain location that someone was going to give him some type of signal, and he would then toss the bag filled with money off the back of the train. It would be collected by the kidnappers, and again, within a certain amount of hours, Charlie would be returned. Now, I have not seen the details of what happened during all of this. I feel like from what I read, it seems that this bag of money was thrown over. Again, I don't know if there was actually money in it or if it was a big scam, but either way, this didn't work out. Charlie was never returned home, and at this point, everything just really began to quiet down. Bill and Joe at this point had vanished. There was no way to keep up with them. The letters had stopped coming in. No more ransom letters. There was no response to the personal ledger. It seemed they were at a dead end until there was another huge break in December of 1874, so just a few months after the abduction. In a seemingly unrelated event in New York, a robbery led to some answers. Judge Charles Van Brunt owned a home in Bay Bridge, Brooklyn, and on the night of December 13th, I guess he wasn't home, and someone tried to rob it. Now, luckily, the neighbors ended up hearing what was going on. And this was a time where you didn't wait for police. None of that. Like, if you saw a problem, you solved it. So the neighbor gathered some men and some rifles, and they went to Judge Van Brunt's house themselves to stop the robbery in progress, essentially. And 2 burglars had been found in the house, and both of them ended up being shot. One of them died immediately, and this man turned out to be Bill Mosher. The other one was shot, but clinging to life, and that was Joe Douglas. Only stayed alive for a short period of time. I think it was just a matter of hours after being shot. And on his deathbed, he decided to make a confession. He said that he and Bill Mosher had in fact been the ones that had abducted Charlie Ross. But unfortunately, he didn't give much information at all after this, despite being stared in the face by absolutely shocked onlookers hearing this confession for themselves. Now, there are 1 million plus different versions of what it's believed Joe Douglas said during this time. This is one of those moments where I feel like some certain things were added for the fun of it. But the most agreed upon seems to be very simple, that Joe said he had no idea where Charlie had been kept, and the only person that did know was Bill Mosher, who had been shot dead just moments prior. He did allegedly mumble something about the boy being returned to his family within a few days, since both men were going to be dead, the abductors would be dead, so the boy would be returned. I don't know how that would have happened, but he allegedly did say this, and obviously people clung to the hope of that. We've had this abduction that, first of all, was absolutely abnormal for this time period and this location, and you have a whole entire nation waiting and watching to see what happens, a whole nation looking for this young boy, and now you finally have this crazy deathbed confession that possibly promises this boy will be returned home. But unfortunately, as the days passed, nothing happened, and Charlie never came home. Now, news of what happened traveled very quickly to the Ross family, and so immediately they went up with Walter, Charlie's brother, to a morgue in New York to have him look at both men to positively identify them as the men that abducted him and his brother. And sure enough, he said, this is absolutely it. Bill had some sort of illness, I think it was cancer or something like that, that had eaten away the cartilage of his nose, which is what Walter had been talking about. So at this point, between the fact that Walter positively identified these men, Bill Mosher's brother even calling them out, this deathbed confession, it seemed pretty clear that these men were in fact likely Charlie Ross's abductors, but now that would mean that all of the answers as to what happened to Charlie and where he is could possibly be totally gone. Police did continue to search for the next 2 or so months, trying to connect anything at all between Bill and Joe to a possible location Charlie could be. They just kept coming up empty-handed until they finally realized that there was another person that could possibly have answers. William Westervelt, who they realized probably was in cahoots with both of these men. I think they realized this guy's playing double agent. He might have information. Right away, they go to question William Westervelt and end up arresting him for kidnapping, and he was thrown into jail to await trial. They didn't seem to have much evidence, I will say that, and I could totally be missing something. There's no way there's accurate police records from the evidence they may have had back then, but there's just not been much that's been publicly stated of what they had on this guy, other than the fact that he was kind of playing double agent. But apparently while he was waiting in jail, he decided to not even help his own case. He allegedly reached out to Christian while awaiting trial and told him, you know what, Charlie was alive when both Bill and Joe died, kind of confirming this idea that he may have information that he's not being very forthcoming with. But apart from that, he never said anything else. He never admitted to having any sort of part in the abduction. He never admitted to knowing where Charlie was. He did the exact opposite. He was very adamant, in fact, that he had absolutely no idea, any details at all, about the abduction of Charlie Ross or his current whereabouts. And that may possibly be true based on his reaction when he was offered immunity. So William Westervelt, at this point, they're just like, we are just over this situation. We want this little boy brought home. We will offer you immunity if you just take us to him. If you have information, at this point, we don't care. Take us to him and you can go be a free man. And he completely denied the offer. He said, I don't know where he is. I can't accept the offer. Now, as you can imagine, because there didn't seem to be much evidence connecting him to the kidnapping itself, kidnapping charges essentially fell flat. He ended up being not found guilty for kidnapping, but because he had been playing that double agent, he was found guilty of conspiracy. And he ended up being sentenced to 6 years in prison and then continued the rest of his life denying having any involvement in the abduction of Charlie Ross. Ross ended up writing a book in 1876 called The Father Story of Charlie Ross, the Kidnapped Child. Christian genuinely hoped that this would keep the eyes on his son's case. Again, this wasn't something very common. Maybe it could reach parents that have gone through similar things and could help them feel not so alone. And on top of that, he really hoped to be able to use all of the money made from the book to continue the search for his son. Now, just an interesting thing to note, in the book, he included 22 of the 23 letters from the kidnappers, but letter number 5 was not included. It was never released, and I don't think anybody has it, so obviously that's piqued a lot of interest from anyone who has looked into the case, believing that there's something within that letter that the Ross family didn't want anyone to see. And that could be a whole handful of things. And it could be something that seems insignificant to a lot of people, but was devastating for the Ross family. Maybe they described something that they did to Charlie, or, just something that they just did not want public, understandably. But a lot of people are very hung up on the fact that that letter was never released. Christian and Sarah did in fact end up making a lot of money off the book. I believe $60,000 is what they ended up spending throughout the rest of their life to look for Charlie. They did nothing but look for him. Christian and Sarah were able to successfully use the funds from the book to spend the rest of their life searching for Charlie. It was around, I believe, $60,000. And if $20,000 in that time period was $400,000 now, $60,000 is a lot of money, but that's because they ended up traveling nationwide. They eventually ended up overseas. Any young child matching Charlie's description, being about the same age, they went to check that child out to make sure it was not their missing son. Sightings also were coming in from all over the place, every corner of the world essentially, and each one was checked by the Ross family to see if it was maybe their missing boy. And so many sightings were actually coming in that they had to develop a way to very quickly say, oh, we've already looked into this person. And they started to give these young boys and young men these certificates that basically said, I've already been checked out by the Ross family and I am not Charlie Ross. I think the estimated total was around 700 different boys and men that had been checked. But unfortunately, none of them ended up being a match. And also, unfortunately, as time went on, many of these different individuals turned out to be money or attention-hungry scammers, families that offered up their young, similar-looking boy, hoping they could get a reward. All sorts of things trying to extort the family, and they caused a lot of significant harm and damage emotionally and physically to the Ross family. Every single time the case would kind of fade away, Christian would come up with another idea to bring it back to the forefront of everyone's minds. He gave a lot of different lectures in Boston. He re-released the book, gave out signed copies of the book, trying to again gather the attention of the public. Christian and Sarah genuinely did every single thing they could possibly do until the day they died to find Charlie. And that happened in 1897 when Christian Ross ended up passing away, followed by his wife in 1912. Both of them passed away, not ever figuring out what happened to their son. Even after Christian and Sarah's death, Charlie's siblings then continued to receive letters filled with claims of answers as to what happened to Charlie. Sightings, grown men saying that they were absolutely Charlie Ross. And it was really exhausting for the family because, again, a lot of these people were simply just trying to extort them. And having to deal with that on a regular basis, I cannot imagine the level of pain that would cause. I feel like when we look at, certain cases that are current, or at least within the past couple of decades, that does unfortunately happen to a lot of families, but it's like a handful of times and that's it. But it seems like almost every single person wanted to take another bite out of the Ross family, even after all the tragedy that they had already endured. One big example of this was a man named Gustave Blair. Now, allegedly, this man had reached out numerous times to the Ross family in the early 1900s, saying that he was very certain he was, in fact, their missing brother, Charlie Ross. The Ross family said that they looked into this the best they could and came to the solid conclusion that this man was not, in fact, Charlie Ross. But he was very persistent, to the point that in 1939, he went to the Maricopa County Court in Arizona and petitioned to be legally declared Charlie Ross and sued the Ross family right along with it for, from my understanding, essentially not believing that he was Charlie Ross. Now, the Ross family was exhausted and fed up with dealing with these kinds of situations, so they didn't even respond to these claims. I'm sure that they figured this would very quickly be debunked and everyone would move on, like the dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of other times prior to this. But after all, the story that this man was saying seemed incredibly far-fetched. He said, I was abducted and then I was put in a cave and I lived in the cave for a while and then eventually was somehow adopted out of the cave, and the people that adopted me told me I was Charlie Ross. And I mean, he did have a bunch of supporting evidence, I guess you could say, like different affidavits and stuff like that, signed confessions from family members that claimed he was Charlie Ross and all of these different things, but the bulk of the story didn't really make a whole lot of sense. How on earth would Charlie have gotten all the way to Arizona, and why would someone have put him in a cave? And then it didn't make any sense. But unfortunately, because there was no pressure back from the Ross family against these claims, the court ended up granting Gustave's wishes. So he was legally declared Charlie Ross, and everyone thought that the once lost boy had somehow been found 60 years later. It was a huge deal, but the Ross family made it very clear that they did not believe this was legitimate. Again, it caused a lot of pain for the family, and from what I have looked into, I don't believe it was until the early 2000s that more answers ended up coming forward. I think it was actually Gustave's family themselves that began to look into this for DNA testing to try to prove if Gustave was, in fact, or was not Charlie Ross. The DNA test was done, and it basically showed that Gustave Blair was not, in fact, Charlie Ross at all. He was actually a man named Nelson Miller. Now, that whole entire family, the Miller family, has gone on to dig into this and figure out why on earth and how on earth this all happened to begin with. It seems that there was just a lot going on in their family at that time. It's possible that Nelson Miller or Gustave Blair had, for a period, actually believed and been told that he was Charlie, but at some point prior to all of this happening and going to the courts, he found out that he actually wasn't, and for some reason continued the lie anyway. So he's buried now under a headstone that reads Charlie Ross. I don't know if anyone has ever changed it, and the actual location of Charlie is still a mystery. His abduction has left a huge mark on missing persons cases and other abductions since. As I said, abductions at that point in time were not very common. And in 1875, after seeing the outcome of this and, what was going on and the harm that could be done, it became clear that this was much more serious than anyone had really ever considered it to be. So that year, Pennsylvania became the very first state to change abductions from a misdemeanor to a felony. All other states soon followed suit. So that, knowing what we know now, things have even continued to take larger steps since then. More strict laws were put into place a couple of decades later with the abduction of the Lindbergh baby, which I will also be doing a video on that. So this was kind of a point in time where people were realizing the harm that other people are willing to do, and the fact that punishment and charges needed to be harsher to hopefully ensure that it would deter people from committing a lot of these crimes. Also set a pretty huge precedent in terms of how missing persons cases were handled. They went into this having no idea what to do, the best methods to use. They were learning everything essentially for the very first time. And it wasn't just a simple abduction or missing child either. We had a child taken from their front yard, and there was a large ransom involved. So much was learned about what should and shouldn't be done, and the power of publicity was realized. Not just that, there's also the Charlie Project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and you may not have even known that the Charlie Project was named after Charlie Ross. I use the Charlie Project on a regular basis. I rely on it heavily, and anyone kind of working in this realm does as well, because it's essentially a database that compiles information from thousands upon thousands upon thousands of missing persons cases. And it is the best place to go and get as much critical information as possible all in one place. The time it happened, the place that it happened, addresses, physical description, photographs, so you can actually see the individual that's missing, the investigating agency, the actual detective that's on the case number. Every single important piece of information in regards to a missing persons case is typically on the Charlie Project. There is the Charlie Project blog, where there's sometimes a brief synopsis that goes a little bit more into detail about what exactly happened. It's honestly an invaluable resource. I don't know if there will ever really be answers as to what happened to Charlie or where he is. I don't know if he will ever be found. But it is just so incredible to me that something that happened so long ago has had such a huge impact and likely changed the way that every single case has been handled since then. And that is the very obvious recurring theme in all of these different cases that I've brought forward that have inspired change, obviously. But I feel like it's just such a hopeful thing to see that despite these awful things that happen in the world, there are things that come out of them that are good. There is a chance that that case has gone on to prevent other people from being abducted or murdered, or you name it. And to me, I feel like that's at least one little shimmer of hope and light in something that is so incredibly dark. So I feel like it's so important to share these different stories and see where we are today even happened to begin with. So I really hope you guys are still enjoying this series and you walk away from this today learning something. Again, if you have any more suggestions, leave them down below for cases that have inspired new laws or big change. I'm always happy to take new suggestions. A lot of these have come straight from you guys, and I really honestly appreciate it. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and go. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to learn about the abduction of Charlie Ross. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallen fam so we can hopefully bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.